All right, thank you, Amy, for the introduction, and thank you, all of you, for coming today. This is awesome. I just found out about these talks a couple months ago, and I thought it was the coolest thing, and here I am. So, and here you are. I see a couple faces from last night. We had an event, so I'm feeling comfortable already. My peeps are here. And I'm looking forward to getting to know all of you that I don't know already. So I'm Hannah Bratterud. I'm a learning consultant and a sales and leadership coach. So I help companies develop training programs for their employees. I work a lot on employee experience, and I also do coaching with business leaders and salespeople to help them increase their revenue and productivity. So today, though, I'm going to talk about what happens in the brain when we have that aha moment, a creative insight, or we solve a complex problem and all of a sudden that solution seems to appear out of nowhere, right? Maybe it comes out of nowhere, maybe not. We're going to dig into that a little bit and see what the conditions are for that. So this is also a learning experience for me. I am a firm believer that if you want to know something, you have to teach it. That's the way to really, really learn it. So I'm currently studying with the NeuroLeadership Institute, studying neuroscience from the perspective of learning how we learn how memory functions, how influence works, how we make decisions, how teams work together, and how our brains are really social and wired for connection. So all of that is stuff that I'm absorbing right now, and so this is a little piece of what I'm learning, and I'm teaching it to you. And so I'd love to hear your feedback afterwards. I left some feedback forms on your chair. There's a little worksheet that we're going to work on. But if you will keep in mind the feedback, it's really helpful for me if you give me some feedback afterwards. So let's jump in. What's an insight? Right? An insight is that moment that we often call the light bulb moment, or the eureka, or the aha moment, right? And so what that is really when we solve a problem, right? A solution just kind of appears to you. So there are different ways of solving problems. But first, I'd like to hear from all of you, or some of you, whoever would like to share, where do you tend to have your best ideas?
Outside.
Right?
Yeah.
Outside?
In the shower.
In the shower?
While I'm driving.
While you're driving? In the trees? All right. Any others? On horses. I get a lot of great ideas riding horses too, actually. So here's some ideas. These are pretty common answers, right? So for some people, it's while they're exercising, or just before or after you're falling asleep. So we're going to talk about why that is. And so all of those answers you gave me, they have some commonality, right? Oh, here's a little bit about me. I already gave my introduction. So there are a couple different ways of solving problems, right? We have an analytical problem solving, which is a very linear way of solving problems, right? My partner is a computer scientist, and so I asked him the question I asked all of you, and you know, to me, his answer was at my desk. I'm like, what? I never have great ideas at my desk. And then, well, as it turns out, a lot of the problems he works on are analytical problems, right? And they require a very linear focus, right? Whereas insight problem solving is diffuse. It's not focused. It's there are weak brain signals, right, versus a strong brain signal, and it requires more of an inward focus. So there is a process to how insights occur. And the first part of it is, and it was surprising to me, I hadn't really thought about it. So your prefrontal cortex, that's your thinking brain, right? where we have executive control and where we make conscious thought. When the PFC is resting and you're not actively focusing on a problem, that's where these insights tend to occur. Right? So some of you said when you're out in nature, when you're walking, when you're in the shower, those types of things, you're not really focusing your mind. That's when the brain can be free to allow those connections to happen. Because what the brain is doing, it's looking to complete patterns. And our brains are problem-solving machines. We're pattern-detecting machines. And your brain's always scanning for patterns and looking for connecting the dots, if you will, and literally making connections, new connections, right? But when we're actively thinking, we're not creating new connections, right? We're following a linear train of thought. So what also happens is during this process, there have been studies when they look at the brain and what happens right before an insight. So they give people insight type of problems while they're in an fMRI machine, and they look at what happens in the brain, right? So they see that they're in the moment before an insight, it's like your other senses kind of go blank a little bit. So your senses are not really perceptive to outward stimuli, right? So it's like this moment that happens where these connections are being made, and there's a sensory gating, right? And that's when the insight occurs. So sometimes we've had that moment where we're trying to tell something and we're trying to search for the word, and it's at the tip of your tongue, and you know it's in there somewhere, and you just can't think of it right then. And what happens? Later, at some random time, it just pops into your head, right? Well, it's your brain completing that pattern or making that connection. And sometimes when we're so focused, we can't do that. And so to transition into actually what happens in the brain when we look at the brain waves, right? There are different types of brain waves at different states. So when you are in deep sleep, you have delta waves, and you can see there's not a high frequency on those. When we're drowsy, kind of right when we're going to sleep or waking up, we have this lower frequency brainwave pattern as well. And then during a relaxed state, those are the alpha waves. They're a little bit more, there's higher amplitude and more frequency. And then the beta waves, that's when we're really alert. And when we are focused, when our senses are really perceptive to everything around us, right? That's when we can measure those beta waves. The gamma waves, there's intense activity if you look at the frequency compared to the other brain waves. So during research in the lab, when they bring people in and they measure the brain activity and they give people these insight puzzles and they solve these puzzles, there's this burst of activity in the brain when an insight happens. And so the gamma waves are what are making all those connections between those diffuse weak signals in the brain. When those connections are being made, there's this powerful burst of energy, of electrical current in the brain. So they've actually tested this to see if there was a causal effect. So they've actually sent electrical current through people's brains, right? And through a specific area of the brain. I think that's it's in a future upcoming slide. But it's possible to actually induce insight just by zapping your brain, right? So I wouldn't recommend that for at-home use. But that's why they've been able to prove that there's a link here, that it's those gamma waves that are actually making that burst of connections happen. So we've talked about these different brain waves, right? So alpha waves, that's when we're in kind of this relaxed state. the visual gating, we have less activity, there's less input, right? And we're not so focused and aware of everything around us. When we have beta wave activity, when we're really alert, the prefrontal cortex is very active and it's a very strong signal, and it's hard for those weaker signals to compete for attention, right? And so that's why and we'll get to it. We'll talk about how we can create those conditions for ourselves, right? But how can we relax our prefrontal cortex? So here's the area, right, in the brain where that sudden burst of activity happens. It's called, and I have to read this, I don't actually know it, the right anterior superior temporal gyrus. That's the specific point in the brain where there's this burst of gamma wave activity when we have an insight. Mood also matters. All right, so there's been other studies that show when they give people these insight problems to solve, and they're in the scanner, and they've first primed people to feel kind of positive and happy and in a slightly positive mood, they solve more of the problems, right? So when we're in a slightly happy, upbeat mood, we're more likely to have a creative or complex insight. So to sum all of this up, and I'm going to have you guys do a little bit of work here and see if we can induce some insight today in our work here. But for the state of the brain to have an insight, it needs to be quiet. Not necessarily physically quiet. Listening to music could be a good condition, right? But your brain has to be quiet. So your prefrontal cortex, your thinking mind, has to be quiet. We have to have a more inward-looking focus rather than an outward-looking focus. And we have to feel slightly happy. When we feel slightly happy, we're in a good position to be able to have a creative insight. And we need to be not actively working on the problem. Now, it's often helpful if you've been working on a problem and you've been, studying it, and maybe you're getting stuck and you're hitting your head against the wall and you're not getting anywhere, right? That's when maybe it might be a good time to take a step back and literally go for a walk, take a shower, any of those things that we've talked about. So for, just for a moment, think about, when do you feel sort of in a really happy, content space, right? How does that happen for you? What is the surroundings? What's around you? What are you hearing? What are you seeing? What are you not seeing? What's your happy place? So when we say go to your happy place, that's a good way to make sure you're in a good state to receive some insight. So now, I want you all to take a moment, and I have some worksheets here for you. You can jot down notes if you want. What is a problem that you faced recently that you were not able to solve right away? Take a moment and just think about it, maybe jot down some notes. So it could be a creative problem, it could be a work problem, it could be a personal problem, just something that you've been trying to find a solution to. All right, so if you have a problem in mind, think about these questions. What else in your life is this problem similar to in some ways? Have you experienced a similar situation or something else that you did that was successful? Have you faced something like this before? And what ideas do you have about this problem? What have you already considered? What are some thoughts? And the last question is, now that we have learned how the insight process works, how may you have interfered with that process in the past when you're trying to solve a problem? If the process requires, for example, not thinking actively on the problem or not focusing on it, not working on it, are there ways that we sabotage ourselves? Maybe in getting too focused or too hung up or too close to it? All right, so now let's share, if you are comfortable, with your neighbor, and you don't have to share the problem if you don't want to, but there's implications for learning and insight, right? So what coaches do, we ask a lot of questions, right? And it's for this very reason, because when we learn things by having an insight, rather than being told the answer, it sticks in our minds, right? And we have a lot more ownership of the solution if we came up with it. And the cool thing is that our brain actually has usually the solution. We just haven't made the connections yet. So that's the whole point here is, to help people from a coach or training or learning or leadership perspective. If you want to help your people be more effective in their work, it might have beneficial implications if you, rather than try to fix it or try to solve it for them, help them to find an insight for themselves, right? So in my work, that's what I try to do. I try to ask people the questions so that they can come up with the solutions to their own problems. So I'm going to have you guys coach each other for a couple minutes, get to know each other a little bit. If you're not comfortable sharing your problem that you talked about, that's okay. But turn to your neighbor and maybe ask them these questions and see if you might be able to come up with some solutions together. So go ahead. So I'd love to hear what you guys have come up with so far. Or you can just keep talking too. I mean, it seems like, who am I to interrupt a good time? No, so I'm curious. So what was that like for you guys? Any thoughts, observations, any insight? Who wants to share?
They're very different problems, types of problems.
Yeah? Different types of problems. Brooke?
Inspired me to take a couple of days off work.
Yeah.
Schedule it as work.
Hey, I like that. I like that. Yeah. What else?
Just admitting that you're struggling with someone to someone else makes you more intentful to do it.
Admitting that you're struggling with something and actually talking about it to someone else. Yeah, I think that just verbalizing what we're experiencing. Again, we usually have the answers, right? Sometimes just talking about it or having someone ask us a question helps us pull from those resources that are in our minds. What else?
Noah and I are working on the same problem, so it's interesting to kind of like bounce stuff between each other's brains.
Yeah.
Figure out what would work and what wouldn't.
Right. Did you get any closer in your conversation?
Not
Not really? Okay.
It's a long
Yeah. Here in the back.
I was just thinking about like
So she's talking about timing, right? Of when is our brain optimized for certain types of activities. Have you read the book When by Daniel Pink?
No.
Okay, it's about exactly that. It came out this year. Anyone who's interested in that topic, read it. It's super interesting about when are you most productive, when are you most creative, when are you, when does your brain, when is your brain more receptive to certain types of activity, right? And different times of day during different kinds of activities, as we've been talking about, right? So having some insight into that helps us be able to schedule our time and our work and structure our days in a way that we can get maximum impact. And I'm with you. For most people, we can do analytical thinking and problem solving and make critical decisions in the morning. In the afternoon, later in the day, we go through this trough in the middle of the day where our focus and attention really dips, right? And then later in the day tends to be when we have more creative or ability to work on creative problems. There's some people that are extreme night owls, for example. There's a little reversal of that where you have, the morning is sort of your recovery time and maybe creative time, and then you're more alert and analytical in the evening. But the majority of people are either early birds, or what does he call them? Third birds, the people in the middle, right, that are not extreme to either side of those.
And so, we just do a quick little survey and see who feels like their ideas are more creative in the morning or
Ooh, great idea. Yeah, so are you more creative in the morning or in the evening? Who's more creative in the morning? Wow, quite a few of you. Who's more creative in the evening? Okay, interesting. It's about half and half. Well, who feels like they can focus better in the morning? Who feels like they can focus better in the evening? Couple people, okay. So that was different. So some of you feel more focused and more creative in the morning. Some of you feel more creative and less focused. For me, creative thinking is a different kind of focus, right? It's more of this type of insight thinking rather than analytical thinking, right? And it's different for each person. But yeah, the book When by Daniel Pink, it goes into all of the scientific studies around this and even historical studies looking at the Titanic sinking, massive disasters that have happened. And very often, those decisions were taken in the afternoon. It's really eerie when they start looking into these different examples, right? So little different topic, but just something to keep in mind, that our brain has different wave signals that are optimized for different types of activities, and that tends to follow a certain pattern or flow throughout your day. All right, any other thoughts or observations? Right here?
I think the six.
But see, there's the key, right? You're brushing your teeth and because I've noticed the same thing. Sometimes when there's so many things, it's like I just sort of let go because I can't focus on all of them. And maybe that's part of it, right? You don't have, and Amy, you asked the question earlier, we don't always have the luxury of time, right? So how do we set this up when we don't have time? And I'm not going to give you the answer, but I'm going to suggest that maybe if you're able to find ways to sort of really disconnect your thinking brain in some way, right? And it could be as simple as just brushing your teeth or while you're in the shower for 5 minutes. I mean, that moment of insight is like a flash, right? That's why we call it a flash of insight. So it can happen, but it very often happens when we've been working on the problem, either actively or subconsciously. The brain is finally suddenly able to make those connections. So great observations. All right, so let's wrap this up here. This is the summary, right? And my little flash of insight this morning was that, and there's a commercial. I wanted to play the song again because the song Don't Worry, Be Happy kind of sums this up for me, right? And we want to be in a slightly happy mood, and I can't not feel happy when I listen to that song, right? It's super mellow and chill and happy, right? That same kind of state of mind that we want to be in when we have an insight. So with that, I'm going to close today. I appreciate your attention, appreciate your involvement. Please do stay in touch. Feel free to reach out anytime. And take a moment to fill out some feedback for me. That would be really valuable as I'm learning more about the brain and how to present about the brain. Thank you, guys.
Okay, thank you.